several crew members were burying the body of their comrade in the Arctic, where the temperature was -40 degrees. Suddenly, the coffin began to shake violently and fell down. The originally sealed coffin lid suddenly burst open, and the corpse lay there, serenely gazing at the crowd. The crew, witnessing this eerie scene, were stunned on the spot. This classic, highly rated thriller series is something you probably haven't seen. The story takes place in September 1845, when two of the most advanced Royal Navy ships set sail from England, attempting to cross the Arctic in search of a new passage to Asia. But after a few months at sea, the ships, along with all their crew members, mysteriously disappeared. After the incident, the rescue team found a Netzelik hunter living in the Arctic. Intending to inquire about the crew's whereabouts, they took out the photos of the captain and the first mate for the Netzelik hunter to identify. The Netzelik hunter had indeed seen these crew members land, intending to return home, but they had provoked something unclean, and in the end, all that was left were a few buttons from the captain's coat. So, what exactly did they encounter? It was the first day of the voyage, and Captain Franklin of HMS Erebus was patrolling the deck. The compass suddenly exhibited strange fluctuations, spinning continuously. The magnetic North Pole moved several miles every day, indicating they had entered the Arctic Circle. To celebrate this promising start, the two captains agreed to have dinner together in the parlor of HMS Terror, enjoying fine beef tongue and premium whiskey. Meanwhile, the crew could only huddle in the storeroom, eating coarse grain. A crew member, while eating, suddenly vomited blood and convulsed uncontrollably. Dark red blood clots were found in David's stool, indicating he likely had scurvy. If the doctor's suspicions were correct, the lives of the other crew members could also be at risk. To be absolutely sure, Captain Franklin of HMS Erebus proposed taking David back for Dr. Goodsir to diagnose again, but during the transfer between the two ships, a sudden strange wind blew, and a crew member of HMS Terror accidentally fell into the icy, bone-chilling sea, freezing to death within seconds. Witnessing this, the other crew members were terrified. Goodsir examined David but found no signs of infection. However, before they could breathe a sigh of relief, David, lying in bed, stared ahead in horror. A shirtless man wearing a bizarre mask appeared before him. Goodsir looked in the direction David was staring but saw nothing. Frightened, David died on the spot. At the same time, the first officer of HMS Erebus reported an emergency to Captain Franklin. The propeller couldn't turn or retract, likely jammed by ice. To restore normal operations, Franklin ordered a crew member to go down and check. Unexpectedly, the 19th century diving suit was incredibly cumbersome, with the soles alone weighing 30 kilograms. For safety, Collins and two crew members coordinated rescue signals. Pulling the rope once meant descending 1 meter, pulling 3 times meant encountering danger and needing to be pulled up immediately. After these preparations, Collins put on his helmet and prepared to dive. From a distance, the sea surface was covered with broken ice. After descending a few meters, Collins found a huge ice block jamming the propeller. Scanning the surroundings to ensure there were no dangerous underwater creatures, Collins began to clear the ice. With a bit of effort, he used an iron rod to break the ice. Just as Collins was relieved at completing the task so smoothly, he suddenly felt a chill down his spine, as if something was staring at him from behind. A dark shadow slowly drifted toward Collins. Seeing the face clearly, he was horrified to find it was the crew member who had fallen into the sea that morning. Strangely, he seemed to have come back to life. Slowly approaching Collins, terrified, Collins frantically pulled the rescue rope. Fortunately, before being scared to death, Collins surfaced. He gulped down several mouthfuls of strong liquor to steady his nerves. At this moment, Captain Franklin asked about the situation underwater. Collins, thinking it was an illusion, did not mention the floating corpse. Although the ice block was cleared in time, the propulsion of HMS Erebus was somewhat affected, barely reaching a speed of 3 knots even at full throttle. However, this did not dampen Captain Franklin's determination to open a new route. Another 200 nautical miles and they would cross the Arctic to reach the Asian continent, filling in the last blank spot on Western navigation charts. Everyone here would receive the highest honors from the British Royal Navy, but Captain Crozier of HMS Terror, concerned for the crew's safety, suggested abandoning the plan to find a new route and instead traveling along the east coast to take the crew home. This proposal was met with strong opposition from Franklin of HMS Erebus, who ordered HMS Terror to break the ice ahead while both ships continued to explore along the west coast. This angered Crozier, who slammed the table in frustration but was powerless to change the decision. As Franklin outranked him, Franklin's arrogance ultimately led to the mysterious disappearance of the entire crew. Less than 100 miles into the journey, the Arctic weather suddenly dropped by more than 20 degrees. The previously shattered ice blocks froze into a solid mass, forcing the crew to disembark and manually break the ice. Even using explosives to blast through, they could only move the ships a few miles. The next day, Franklin walked onto the deck to inspect the ice conditions. As he looked into the distance, there was no longer a trace of open water. Franklin gathered all the crew members and dispatched 2 expedition teams to head east and west from the ships, hoping to find a passage through the melting ice and escape their predicament. However, one expedition team encountered a deadly chase by the polar tunback. After walking several miles, they marveled at an ice mountain formed by piled-up blocks, a testament to nature's craftsmanship. After securing their supply-laden boats, they prepared to climb over and investigate. Using ice axes, they soon reached the summit, where they indeed saw a stretch of land in the distance. One crew member used binoculars to spot a pile of stones far off. They speculated it was left by the Inuit, marveling at how people could survive in the harsh Arctic environment by hunting seals. They wrote a letter of distress, hoping a passing trade caravan would find it, but upon returning to their camp, they were horrified to find their supply boat overturned, with no traces of human activity or animal footprints around. By this time the first expedition had returned to HMS Erebus and had traveled 11 miles east with no sign of the glacier's melted track. Captain Franklin wonders why he's the only one back, and the crew says there's a problem with their food. The problem Franklin feared had arisen. If the ice did not melt before their food ran out, they would starve in this remote Arctic expanse. The other westward expedition team was setting up camp, planning to return to HMS Erebus the next morning. Suddenly, something fell from above. On closer inspection, it was a football-sized chunk of ice, soon followed by a larger one that smashed onto their fire pit. Had it hit someone, it would have been fatal. The crew took shelter in their tent, but soon heard the roar of a beast, suspecting the polar bear that overturned their boat had returned. If they don't get rid of it, they won't be able to sleep well tonight. So the crew bravely step out of their tents to prepare for the hunt. One crew member climbed a hill and saw a shadow. He fired, and the creature fell. But upon closer inspection, they found they had wounded an Inuit elder. Lady Silence, seeing her father injured, screamed at the crew. The crew couldn't understand her language, so they hurriedly took the elder back to HMS Erebus, hoping Goodsir could save him. Goodsir prepared to cut open the elder's clothes to examine the wound, but Lady Silence vehemently objected. She thought Goodsir was harming her father. Fortunately, Captain Crozier, fluent in Inuit, patiently explained that they were trying to save him. After some treatment, Goodsir regretted that the bullet had gone too deep into the tissue to be cured. Lady Silence cried and pleaded for her father to live because she wasn't ready for those Tunback to obey her. This statement baffled everyone present. In his final moments, the elder chanted a strange incantation. Lady Silence, in a frenzy, picked up her father, insisting he must die on the ice. But before they could fetch a stretcher, the elder passed away. Franklin decides to kick Lady Silence off the HMS Erebus to avoid trouble. However, Captain Crozier, determined to get to the bottom of the Tunback attack, insisted on bringing Lady Silence back to HMS Terror for her safety. Goodsir then reported to both captains about the murder of Captain Graham. He had witnessed a creature resembling a bear biting Graham, with footprints at the scene measuring 50 centimeters. Though the body was not found, there was so much blood that no one could survive after losing that much. Moreover, while treating the Inuit elder, Goodsir discovered the elder had no tongue, as if it had been cut out by something sharp. With no leads, Crozier returned to HMS Terror to inquire about the Tunback from Lady Silence, but Lady Silence firmly warned him that if he wanted his crew to survive, he must sail away immediately, or they would face endless pursuit by the Tunback. Crozier explained that their ship was frozen and they could only leave once the ice melted. Meanwhile, 2 crew members on HMS Erebus were handling the elder's corpse and found 2 strange items under his hat brim. One was a carving of a polar bear, and the other was a humanoid figure. Goodsir speculated these might be the elder's talismans and kindly suggested putting them back. When Lady Silence received her father's belongings, she noticed these 2 items were missing and urgently reached out to the crew for them, indicating their importance. Captain Franklin did not believe in the existence of the Tunback and ordered his men to dig an ice hole nearby and throw the elder's body into it. To ensure the body sank to the bottom, they used 2 5-meter-long poles to push it down, an act that gravely insulted the Inuit. Little did they know that the dead Inuit had made a pact with the Tunback, and that the crew would be hunted down by the Tunback. Seeing this, Lady Silence, to punish them, drew a circle on the ice not far from the ships, preparing to build an igloo to attract the Tunback. Although Franklin didn't believe in the Tunback, he still ordered a few crew members to set up a hidden tent and rewarded them with a bottle of whiskey. The idea was to be ready to kill the Tunback if it appeared. But what could attract the Tunback? The crew caught over a dozen large rats, gutted them, and hung them neatly outside the tent. Franklin praised the crew for their ingenuity. To commemorate this moment, Franklin asked Goodsir to bring a camera to take a group photo. For Goodsir, the few seconds of taking the photo felt like an eternity, as he was the only one who had seen the Tunback's terror firsthand. After the photo, Goodsir quickly packed up and left. Shortly after Goodsir left, the Tunback suddenly appeared from the rooftop and grabbed a crew member. The crew member was then dropped from a great height, killing him instantly. The crew fired several shots toward the mountaintop but never saw the Tunback. Only then did Franklin believe in the creature's existence. Hearing the gunshots, Captain Crozier observed through a telescope and saw Franklin and his crew retreating in defeat. He decisively ordered his men to take up arms and provide support. Crozier's eyelids were almost ripped off because he had been watching for too long, so you can imagine how cold it was in the Arctic at -40°C. Franklin shouted for help towards HMS Erebus, and James, along with 3 other crew members, hurried over. Franklin had already seen the figures of James and his men as he climbed over the hill. At that moment, the Tunback grabbed Franklin's ankle, causing him to scream in pain as he rolled down the slope. Ahead was the ice hole where the Inuit was buried. Franklin, now only half a body, was dragged to the hole's edge. It was then he felt regret for provoking the Inuit. The Tunback pushed Franklin down, but he got caught on a brazier suspended in midair as he fell. In the end, this arrogant captain received the punishment he deserved. When James arrived at the scene, he found only a severed leg of Franklin, and not far away were the huge footprints left by the Tunback. They hurriedly followed the direction of the footprints to rescue Franklin, but upon seeing the entrance to the ice hole stained with fresh red blood, they realized something terrible had happened. James called for the crew to get ropes and prepare to retrieve the body. By then, Franklin had already sunk into the bottomless Arctic ice sea. The death of a captain, not just an ordinary crew member, meant Franklin's funeral could not be as hasty as that of the Inuit elder. Even though only a leg of Franklin remained, Goodsir did not dare to be careless. He dressed the leg meticulously and ceremoniously, and placed it in a standard Navy coffin. The crew of HMS Erebus spontaneously hummed a song to send Franklin off. The hardest hit here was James. With Franklin dead, Crozier was now in charge, and no one would oppose his decisions anymore. But Captain Crozier was not a petty person but a gentleman. He had repeatedly suggested abandoning the plan to find a new route and taking the crew home. To let Franklin's soul rest in peace, Crozier held a grand memorial service. The eulogy was not written by him but by Graham, who had been killed by the Tunback. It was now used for Franklin. Meanwhile, due to the death of the Inuit elder, the Tunback was looking for a new human to forge a contract with. Lady Silence was undoubtedly the best candidate. She was in the snow house, sharpening a small knife, preparing to avenge her father. Suddenly, terrifying sounds came from outside. Lady Silence was sure the Tunback had come for her. The Tunback's breath caused snowflakes to fly chaotically. Such a terrifying scene could easily scare an ordinary person to death. Once it was quieter, Lady Silence dared to crawl out of the snow house to check. Looking around, she didn't see the Tunback, but there was a dead snow leopard lying in the snow at her doorstep. This was a gift from the Tunback. It wouldn't be long before Lady Silence would make a contract with the Tunback. Even if she disagreed, she had no choice. After killing Captain Franklin, the Tunback's anger was not appeased and it continued attacking the crew on the ships. Crozier rallied 30 crew members to get off the ship and rescue them. A young crew member, too scared to stay on the ship, begged Crozier to take him along. Crozier kindly reminded the young sailor to pull up his scarf to avoid frostbiting his nose. As they crossed an ice hill, Crozier saw a body lying on the ice. Thinking it was a missing crew member, he hurried over to check. When Crozier lifted the fur, he found only a pool of blood and realized it was a trap. He turned and shouted the young sailor's name but received no response. When Crozier returned, he was horrified to find the sailor had already been taken by the Tunback. This incident made Crozier vaguely feel that the Tunback was not only fierce but also possibly intelligent. Worse still, the last bit of Arctic sunlight had disappeared from the horizon, and the months-long polar night was beginning. In the dim conditions, it would be easier for the Tunback to hunt them. The young sailor's death made Crozier feel extremely guilty. By this time, he had long abandoned the plan to find a new route. No honor or achievement was worth more than getting the remaining crew home safely. However, First Mate James of HMS Erebus wanted to carry on Captain Franklin's legacy. He claimed that every one of them was here voluntarily, fighting for honor. He He planned to continue searching for a new route when the ice melted in the spring. Faced with James's stubbornness, Crozier had nothing to say. Frustrated, he left James's cabin in a huff. Meanwhile, the arrival of the polar night, combined with the Thunback's relentless pursuit, caused many crew members to panic. Crew member Hickey, while on patrol, noticed a strange figure suddenly appearing on the deck. After a few seconds of thought, he decided to investigate. Hickey gently touched the person's shoulder, and the figure collapsed to the ground. It was unclear how long he had been dead, but the body was frozen stiff and had been severed at the waist. Seeing this, Hickey was also frightened, but not far away, the Thunback had not left. It stared at him menacingly, as if issuing a warning. Hickey believed that Lady Silence was directing the Thunback to hunt the crew, so he persuaded 2 crew members to capture her. This action caused a stir among the crew. Hickey became a hero in the eyes of the crew, but Captain Crozier fired a shot to stop the commotion. He declared that without any evidence of guilt, no one had the right to use violence against Lady Silence. By capturing Lady Silence without permission, they had defied Crozier's authority. To punish them, he ordered each to receive 20 lashes. Hearing this, Hickey was defiant and openly confronted Crozier.
You should be prosecuting her, not us who brought her
20 for him.
I might have just ended this thing, sir. She's had it kill 1 lieutenant.
30
a Marine,
then.
Sir John. I mean, whose name do you think was on that witch's tongue next? I just saved your life!
Crozier increased the original 20 lashes to 30 and ordered his subordinate to administer the child's punishment to Hickey. That is to say, stripped naked and spanked, which is certainly the greatest insult to a soldier. Despite the excruciating pain, Hickey endured it without making a sound, solidifying his heroic status among the soldiers. After this incident, Hickey was completely blackened. At the same time, Dr. Goodsir noticed something wrong with the crew's health. Their teeth were turning an unhealthy black and yellow, and gray lines were visible in their tissues. He consulted Dr. Stanley of HMS Terror to see if their crew exhibited similar symptoms. They suspected either spoiled canned food or lead poisoning from the lead-lined water tanks, but they couldn't determine the exact cause. To avoid panic, they kept this information quiet. Crozier's authority was challenged because he chose to inform his crew of the truth. HMS Terror was at risk of being crushed by the ice, and the crew could voluntarily seek refuge on HMS Erebus. Despite the tempting rewards for staying on HMS Terror, only a dozen crew members chose to remain. This left Crozier, who always prioritized his crew's safety, feeling betrayed. He turned to whiskey to get through the long, torturous nights. Meanwhile, the influx of crew members seeking refuge irritated First Mate James of HMS Erebus. He meticulously inspected each crew member's fingernails, punishing those with dirty nails with 3 days of hard labor. He warned them to maintain cleanliness if they wanted to stay on HMS Erebus, or they'd be sent back to HMS Terror. Crozier invited Goodsir from HMS Erebus to thank him for taking care of Lady Silence recently. Over the past month, Goodsir had become more proficient in the Inuit language, but had not gleaned any information about the Thunback from Lady Silence. Whenever he broached the subject, Lady Silence seemed to evade the topic. Crozier decided to summon Lady Silence to ask directly if she had ordered the Thunback to throw Captain Franklin into the ice hole. Lady Silence vehemently denied Crozier's accusation and stated that the Thunback currently had no pact with anyone. She was only just beginning to attempt communication with the Thunback. But now Thunback has killed 5 crew members. As the captain of the ship, he must give the victims an explanation. Crozier intended to ask from Lady Silence how to kill Thunback. At the mention of killing the Thunback, Lady Silence refused to cooperate. Crozier had no choice but to organize a kill squad and appointed Blunkey as the leader. As Blunkey stepped onto the deck, he heard a scream. One of the crew members had just run out of a tent when the Thunback flipped the tent over, crushing the crew member inside. They searched for a long time but couldn't find any trace of the Thunback. The captain spotted the Thunback at the stern, ready to ambush the crew above. Crozier quickly alerted Blunkey and the others through a gap in the hatch. The crew raised their guns, aiming at the stern. Blunkey climbed the mast, intending to use himself as bait to lure the Thunback into the open. As Blunkey reached the signal tower, he was horrified to find the Thunback already chasing him. He climbed up the 100-meter mast, desperately fleeing. The ferocious Thunback was right beneath him, shaking the rigging to try and throw Blunkey off. Blunkey shouted to the other crew members to fetch the cannon to deal with the Thunback. As the rigging began to fall, Blunkey grabbed onto the signal tower. He climbed up and found a dried-out oil lamp. Shaking it, he discovered some leftover oil inside and immediately got an idea. He took out the wick, then jumped onto another mast, tightly clinging to it to avoid the Thunback's attacks. Thunback scratched Blunkey's thigh and he screamed in pain. Blood gushed from the wound, but Blunkey had no time to treat it as the Thunback was eager to devour him. Fortunately, he evaded it in time and wasn't caught. Blanqui, enduring the pain, climbed to the top of the railing. Meanwhile, the crew below prepared the cannon for a deadly strike against the Tunback. But when Captain Crozier looked up, all he saw was a white blur with no sign of the Tunback. The only option was to rely on Blanqui above to help them target the creature. Gritting his teeth through the pain, Blanqui tied a rope around his injured thigh. Crozier shouted Blanqui's name, signaling that the cannon was loaded and ready, just waiting for his signal. Understanding the message, Blanqui lit the wick and threw it onto the Tunback. The flames ignited instantly, burning the Tunback's back. In the light of the flames, the crew below finally saw the Tunback. Blanqui and the Tunback fell simultaneously. Luckily, Blanqui had tied a rope around his thigh beforehand, otherwise, he would have been smashed to pieces. But when the crew came down to check, they found no sign of the Tunback's body, only a pool of blood on the ground. This incident infuriated the Tunback, and it let out a mad roar from within the ice, vowing to exact revenge on the humans. Crozier climbed the mast to rescue Blanqui, only to see Lady Silence seizing the opportunity to escape from HMS Terror. He had no time to stop her. When the crew brought Blanqui back to the cabin, his body was already frozen stiff. Crozier gave him the last bottle of whiskey to ease the pain. Blanqui's bravery was commendable. With a painful scream, the doctor sawed off Blanqui's left leg without any anesthesia. After the failed attempt to kill the Tunback, Crozier felt immense guilt. He called all the senior officers to the meeting room, admitting he was no longer capable of commanding the crew. Moreover, many crew members had followed James of HMS Erebus, so Crozier handed over the captaincy to James. But Crozier had no intention of giving up. With tears in his eyes, he vowed to bring the crew home. But the moldy canned food on the ship posed a greater threat to the crew than the Tunback. If they continued eating it, the crew might all be poisoned. Goodsir did not want to see such a tragedy occur, so he caught the monkey that Captain Franklin had kept and decided to conduct an experiment. Goodsir fed the already spoiled canned food to the monkey, carefully recording its physical condition. By the third day, the monkey became extremely aggressive. To prevent it from harming the crew, he had to temporarily lock it in the storeroom. Goodsir looked through the cracks and saw blood everywhere from the monkey's impacts. Once it was quiet, Goodsir dared to open the door and check. To his horror, he found the monkey dead. When he pried open its mouth, he saw that its teeth were black and yellow, clear signs of lead poisoning. Long-term consumption of such food would lead to mental instability and eventually death. These canned goods could no longer be consumed. After the failed attempt to kill the Tunback, the ship's senior officers held another emergency meeting. Crozier did not attend due to falling seriously ill after the failed attempt, since setting sail in September 1845. These British sailors had been trapped in the Arctic for 3 years. Irving took inventory of all remaining supplies on both ships and found that the coal would run out by November unless they immediately reduced heating time. The food would also be depleted before winter arrived, at which point they would be in absolute peril. James decided to cut the crew's food rations by a quarter. In a week, the Arctic polar night would end, and he planned to lead the crew on foot out of the Arctic. After the meeting, Blanqui stayed behind, expressing concern that drastically reducing food and heating would have dire consequences. He shared his previous experience of being trapped in the Arctic with James. In the most difficult times, people lose their sanity, becoming more terrifying than the Tunback. The only thing that could keep the crew sane was the bond between them. After considering for a moment, James decided to hold a carnival, intending to strengthen the crew's bonds and distract them from their fear. Hearing about the carnival, the crew's spirits lifted, and they set up the necessary tents 800 meters from the ships. Irving worried that the carnival would use up a significant portion of their supplies. Halfway through the carnival, Crozier heard about it and, with his second-in-command, hurried over to join the festivities. As soon as he arrived, he saw the crew recklessly wasting food, behaving nothing like shipwreck survivors trapped in the icy wilderness. Furious, Crozier wanted to stop it immediately but was intercepted by James, who explained his plan. Although Crozier agreed with James's plan, he didn't want to deceive the crew. He ordered his subordinates to gather everyone and reveal the truth to them. A few hours later, the first ray of sunlight after the polar night would appear, marking the end of the long and eerie winter. Crozier knew he had to seize this opportunity to lead everyone on foot out of there. Heading south for 1,280 kilometers would bring them to the mainland. Meanwhile, after escaping, Lady Silence couldn't bear to see the crew suffer at the hands of the Tunback. She decided to use the method her father taught her to form a pact with the Tunback. She divided the seal meat into dozens of pieces and arranged them in a circle. Kneeling, she began to chant a strange incantation. Within seconds, the Tunback appeared beside her. Lady Silence took out a small knife and cut her own tongue to complete the offering. But for some reason, The Toonback did not accept it and instead became enraged. Dragging her weakened body, Lady Silence fled to the carnival to escape the Toonback's pursuit. Seeing the white-haired Lady Silence, Goodsir was greatly surprised. He hurriedly went to support her, only to discover that her tongue was missing. At that moment, a crew member suddenly went mad, pouring a bucket of strong liquor over himself and setting himself on fire with a torch in front of everyone. Instantly, the crew member became a walking inferno, slowly moving toward the crowd. This horrifying scene stunned all the crew members present. Though the flames were extinguished, the crew member died on the spot. Worse still, a fire broke out around the tent, trapping everyone inside the flames. They finally found an opening to escape, but Stanley was trampled to death in the chaos. When Crozier and his men cleared the fire, they found the burned ship's flag and resolutely took it down. Dozens of crew members died in the fire, leaving James feeling immensely guilty. If it weren't for his decision to hold the carnival, this tragedy might not have happened. Crozier stepped forward to comfort James, insisting it wasn't his fault. At that moment, the first ray of sunlight after the polar night slowly rose. Amid their sorrow, they finally saw a glimmer of hope. This incident dissolved the long-standing tension between Crozier and James. James no longer held any illusions about finding a new route. He decided to follow Crozier and lead the remaining crew on a trek to the mainland, 1,280 kilometers away. James ordered the crew to pack essential supplies and discard anything unnecessary. Crozier then shared his thoughts with James. It turned out that after Captain Franklin's death, Crozier had sent an expedition team back to the mainland. It had been 3 months since their departure, and they might be on their way back with supplies. Additionally, the direction to the mainland led to an Inuit settlement. Meeting them would give them a chance to survive. However, Hickey had his own plans. He conspired with a few unscrupulous crew members to steal supplies and split from the main group once they reached solid ground. This was the most difficult moment before departure. To increase the marching speed, Crozier asked the weaker crew members to stay on the ship, promising to send a rescue team after reaching the mainland. He left them enough food to survive the winter. If the ice melted, they would still have the opportunity to sail the ship and complete the mission of finding a new route. Those who stayed would make history. The crew gladly accepted Crozier's request, swearing to find the new route and claim this honor. On April 22, 1848, Captain Crozier ordered the abandonment of the ship, leading 126 crew members on foot towards the mainland.
Forward, men!
But after traveling 19 kilometers, 2 advanced scouts discovered something unusual and called for Captain Crozier and first mate James to investigate. They found a dozen frozen corpses with their heads exposed above the snow. They were the members of the expedition team Crozier had sent out earlier. Unexpectedly, after leading the ship for only 19 kilometers, they were killed by the Toonback. Their deaths incredibly gruesome. To avoid causing panic among the other crew members, Crozier, in the name of the military court, ordered the 2 crew members present, including James, not to spread this information. Then he continued leading the crew forward. However, the massive supply boat severely hindered their marching speed, so Crozier put aside his captain's dignity and acted as a laborer. After walking a short distance, they encountered an ice mountain formed by piled-up blocks of ice. Admiring the natural wonder before them, Crozier couldn't help but marvel at nature's craftsmanship. As Crozier and James climbed over to take a look, they finally saw the mainland ahead, offering a glimmer of hope for survival. They led the crew to set up camp and rest there. A crew member suddenly came running, requesting to increase the patrol and arm each patrol member with a gun. He suggested several suitable candidates, including Hickey. Hearing Hickey's name, Crozier immediately became alert and decisively rejected the suggestion. Edward didn't understand why Crozier refused. Crozier explained that while the crew member's suggestion was reasonable, someone like Hickey was a constant threat to military order, and they had to be on guard against rebellion. That night, an unexpected incident occurred. A crew member started shouting and then collapsed. Goodsir rushed over to examine him. The crew member seemed mentally unstable. As soon as he was helped up, he began looking around frantically. When the crew member saw Crozier, he made a bizarre request, asking the captain to order his head to be cut off. Crozier was baffled, wondering why anyone would seek death in such a manner. He approached to comfort the crew member, but the man suddenly grabbed a guard's rifle. This alarmed the other crew members, who quickly raised their guns in defense. Crozier ordered them not to shoot. Meanwhile, another crew member in the tent started showing similar symptoms, his body convulsing uncontrollably. Crozier carefully tried to soothe the armed crew member, hoping he would put down the gun, but the man seemed startled and was then shot dead. Crozier turned his head and saw that it was the crew member influenced by Hickey who had fired the shot. Unaware of the full context, Crozier ordered his subordinates to properly bury the crew member. He was well aware that the moldy canned food had caused the hallucinations and decided that they could no longer consume those rations. The next day, Crozier held an emergency meeting and decided to send out 2 hunting teams. Upon hearing the news, Hickey secretly summoned 2 crew members to his tent, expressing that soon many crew members would either go insane or be poisoned. Hickey had already discovered the secret in the canned food. As they prepared to depart and enjoy their last meal, Lady Silence joined the food line but was quickly taken away by Goodsir. Hickey then suspected that the captain was hiding something from everyone. The crew members' insanity last night further solidified his belief. Hickey killed the captain's dog and threw it in front of them. It would feed the 3 of them for days. Following the captain's plan would leave everyone hungry, and with Hickey's persuasive words and the lure of food, the 2 crew members gradually chose to join his group. Irving led the hunting team to search for game. To be more efficient, they split into 2 groups, planning to meet up before sunset. Unexpectedly, as they crossed a hill, they saw a group of Inuit, laden with freshly hunted game, heading home. Irving ordered Hickey and Far to wait in place while he ran down to seek help from the Inuit. At this moment, Far couldn't help but admire Crozier's wisdom. As Crozier said, there will be a group of Inuit here, so he can ask for their help. But Hickey's eyes suddenly turned vicious, as if he were plotting something terrible. When Irving approached, he immediately raised his hands, and the Inuit lowered their guard. Unable to speak the Inuit language, Irving could only gesture with his hands. The Inuit understood that he needed food and generously handed him some freshly hunted seal meat. It was the freshest food Irving had eaten in 3 years. To show his gratitude, Irving took out his personal telescope and gave it to them, carefully teaching them how to use it. The Inuit were overjoyed to receive such a treasure. However, when Irving turned around, he noticed that Hickey and Far were no longer on the hilltop. Fearing they had encountered the Tunbak, Irving asked the Inuit to wait while he went to check. As soon as Irving reached the top, he saw Hickey strangely sitting on Far. Shouting his name elicited no response. After some hesitation, Irving decided to investigate, only for Hickey to suddenly leap up and stab him several times. Fearing that Irving would make noise, Hickey covered his mouth, watching Irving slowly die. Hickey's expression was one of perverse satisfaction. At this moment, Hickey had completely turned to the dark side. Whether it was the canned food affecting his sanity, his next actions were even more heinous. Returning to the camp, Hickey loudly exaggerated the savagery of the Inuit. He claimed that groups of 20 to 50 families gathered, and there were possibly around 100 of them now advancing toward the camp for revenge. Hickey's words caused the crew to panic, and he did so in order to overthrow Captain Crozier's rule. Upon learning what had happened, Crozier was utterly shocked. He quickly summoned the crew members involved to get a clear understanding of the situation. The crew members explained that initially, Hickey had claimed to have discovered that the Inuit had killed Irving. When they reached the hilltop, they indeed found the bodies of Irving and Far, arranged in a bizarre manner. Without any evidence, they decided it was Inuit and brutally murdered several Inuit. Hearing Hickey's name made Crozier immediately alert, sensing that the situation wasn't as simple as it seemed. From his understanding, the Inuit were simple and kind, unlikely to have killed the crew so savagely. Thus, Crozier brought Lady Silence to examine Lieutenant Irving's body. Seeing Irving's upper body riddled with stab wounds, he asked Lady Silence if this was the way her people would act. Lady Silence shook her head, denying it. To get to the bottom of things, Crozier decided to take some men to the scene of the incident. Before leaving, Crozier instructed Edward to keep a close watch on the armory and, under no circumstances, distribute guns to the crew. But as soon as they left, Lieutenant Tozer, who had been influenced by Hickey, quietly slipped out of the tent. Hickey and Tozer exchanged secret codes as they passed each other.
Guns.
Taking advantage of the thickening fog, Tozer falsely claimed to have heard Inuit whistling. He deceived the crew into believing the Inuit were ambushed 400 meters away. It didn't take long for the rumor to spread through the camp. Tozer led the frightened crew to seize the armory. Edward also began to panic. He decided to distribute guns and join the crew in fighting off the supposed invaders, hastily recording the issued weapons. When Crozier and his men arrived at the scene, he found that the dead Inuit had been shot in the back, as if they were ambushed from behind. Among the victims were elderly people, women, and children, none of whom had weapons. They only had the telescope that Irving had given them. On the sled, they also found a bag of seal meat. Seeing her people's tragic deaths, Lady Silence shed tears. Meanwhile, James showed signs of physical decay, a clear symptom of advanced lead poisoning. Collins had gone insane, wearing a creepy smile as he looked around. To him, the living people appeared as delectable meals. Collins grabbed someone, ready to bite, but luckily, the person escaped in time. Combined with the turmoil among the crew, the camp had become the most dangerous place. Unaware of this, Crozier led his men back to the camp.
Damn your eyes! It's their captain! I've asked that now!
Almost getting shot upon arrival as they were mistaken for invading Inuit. After confirming their identities, Crozier stood up, realizing they had been mistaken for the enemy. First Mate James walked over and reported the situation at the camp to Crozier. Not long after Crozier left, the armory was broken into. Fearing an Inuit attack, panicked crew members had stolen 20 guns. Many crew members had also been swayed by Hickey and joined his mutiny. Facing this sudden crisis, Crozier's first concern was Lady Silence's safety. If he took Lady Silence back to the camp now, she might be shot on sight. After careful consideration, Crozier decided to give Lady Silence some food and instructed her to return to her tribe and survive, never to come back. After saying goodbye to Lady Silence, Crozier returned to the tent and urgently called in Lieutenant Edward, questioning why he hadn't secured the armory and had distributed 20 guns to the regular crew members. Edward hastily explained that the fog had made him panic, and he feared the Inuit were really coming for revenge, which is why he acted as he did. What started as an imagined external invasion turned into a real internal rebellion. After pondering for a moment, Crozier decided to first find evidence to indict Hickey. Hoping to salvage the situation, Crozier called Goodsir to perform an autopsy on Irving's body, finding undigested seal meat in his stomach. This indicated that Irving had been on good terms with the Inuit at the time, with the telescope and seal meat serving as evidence of their mutual assistance. These two items were undeniable proof of Hickey's crimes. Crozier ordered the arrest of Hickey and Tozer and disarmed everyone below the rank of officer. To judge Hickey for his crimes, they erected a gallows in the -40-degree Arctic. Just as Crozier stood in front to present the truth, Tozer couldn't wait to accuse Crozier. Tozer brought up the incident when they found the advance expedition team dead and how Crozier had ordered them to keep it secret in the name of a military court. Facing this sudden accusation, Crozier remained calm, saying that it was his decision and that he would do the same again to keep everyone's hope alive. Crozier's generous and resolute words restored the crew's trust in him. Then Crozier ordered his subordinate to open the bag at his feet, which contained fresh seal meat. He told everyone about finding undigested seal meat during Irving's autopsy, and Goodsir confirmed it. This meant that the Inuit had been helping them, but Hickey had framed them, instigating a war between them and the Inuit. Crozier warned that anyone who followed Hickey would meet a bad end, but just as Crozier ordered Hickey to be hanged, an eerie laugh suddenly emerged from the fog. Everyone turned towards the sound to see the insane Collins laughing and walking towards the crowd. Then came a roar, and Collins had led the tune back to the camp. Hickey and Tozer took advantage of the chaos to escape. An old sailor, seemingly scared out of his wits, stood there spinning in circles. Captain Crozier looked everywhere for Hickey and saw him grabbing several weapons and attempting to flee. Crozier decisively shot Hickey. A few crew members who had been influenced by Hickey took supplies and prepared to follow him in escaping the camp. Tozer was held at gunpoint by Edward, who was furious at his old friend's betrayal. Edward hesitated, unsure whether to shoot Tozer, but was suddenly knocked out by another crew member. The insane Collins, whose laughter had attracted the Tunback, was torn apart within seconds. However, the Tunback didn't seem to be feeding but rather consuming souls. James rushed to the tent and opened a dusty wooden box. He took out a rocket and prepared to strike a fatal blow to Tunback. With the Tunback in front of him, he lit the fuse without hesitation. Even such a fierce creature feared human technology, and when a second rocket flew at it from behind, the Tunback turned and fled. This crisis resulted in 32 crew members dead and 23 missing. Hickey led a 10-man squad in a mutiny and captured Goodsir. Crozier couldn't help but lament that 3 years ago, they had set sail from Greenhithe with 133 men. Who could have imagined the calamities they would face now? For the sake of the surviving crew making it home safely, they had to press on, carrying the names of their fallen comrades back to their families to provide some solace. Crozier ordered his subordinates to cremate the deceased crew members, and then they continued their journey south. However, the long march took a toll on James's health, and he collapsed. When they lifted his shirt, they saw that his festering flesh was bleeding. James's eyes were also bloodshot. Seeing this, Crozier decided to set up camp. After taking stock, they realized they had finished their salted meat and had only a few biscuits and chocolates left, which wouldn't last long. Edward suggested leaving the sick crew members behind, as they were severely slowing down the group's progress. He proposed that the main group continue south and return for the sick if they found enough food, but Crozier pointed out that he had been sending out hunting parties every day without any success. Abandoning the sick would be tantamount to sentencing them to death. Abandoning the wounded was the way of Hickey's group. If they had to discard something to ensure they got home safely, it should be an object, not a fellow crew member in dire straits. That night, James's condition reached its limit. He requested that Crozier allow his body to be used to feed the starving crew. In his final moments, James asked Crozier to end his suffering. These two requests filled Crozier with immense sorrow, but he decided to give James some poison to ensure a dignified death. At this moment, the first mate's soul could not return home. Captain Crozier did not honor James's wish but ordered his body to be properly buried, carving the date of his death on his boots. Little did he know that the boots would end up on the feet of the heartless Hickey. Hodgson, starving, tore a piece of leather from his beloved military boots and, after much hesitation, put it in his mouth, chewing it, accidentally breaking a tooth. A day earlier, the Tunback had attacked Crozier's camp, and Hickey had led 10 men in a mutiny, escaping Crozier's authority. This crisis resulted in the deaths of 30 crew members. With 23 missing, the lone Lieutenant Hodgson soon encountered Hickey's group. In an attempt to recruit Hodgson, Hickey offered him water and, using food as bait, invited him to join. However, their food was actually the corpses of their comrades. At this point, the weakened Gibson approached Goodsir, saying that it felt like his knees were filled with shards of glass, causing unbearable pain. After a thorough examination, Goodsir explained that this was a symptom of lead poisoning, which would only worsen over time. Soon, all joints would become painful until death. As Hickey walked in, he noticed Gibson's condition. He offered a few comforting words before leaving the tent. When Hickey returned, he had a knife in hand. Taking advantage of Gibson's distraction, he stabbed him from behind. Goodsir rushed forward to stop him, but within seconds, Gibson was dead. Hickey then ordered Goodsir to butcher Gibson's body for food. Faced with such a monstrous demand, Goodsir resolutely refused, stating he would rather starve than eat his comrade's flesh. If Hickey wanted to eat, he would have to cut it himself, but Hickey wanted to implicate Goodsir in his crimes, saying that if Goodsir didn't comply, he would kill one person every hour. He told Goodsir not to cling to his moral integrity when faced with material scarcity. Goodsir had no choice. He threw the 2 packs of cut meat in front of Hickey. Meanwhile, a sentinel reported an urgent situation to Crozier. The Tunback was lingering within a 1.5-kilometer radius and had not left. The Tunback appeared to be injured by James's rocket, and once it healed, it might attack them again. After pondering for a moment, Crozier decided to take the initiative and attack. He planned to set up an ambush on a hilltop. They would place stakes at the foot of the hill to trap the Tunback. If they used all their ammunition, they might be able to kill the Tunback once and for all. However, Blanqui didn't want Crozier to take this risk. If they failed, everyone would die there. Blanqui suggested they continue inland while he acted as bait to lure the Tunback back onto the ice. Hearing Blanqui's suggestion, Crozier decisively refused. He didn't want to lose 2 friends in one day, but Blanqui was very determined. When he rolled up his pant leg, his knee, bitten by the Tunback, was already inflamed and rotten. Weighing the pros and cons, Crozier had no choice but to agree to Blanqui's plan. They embraced in farewell, using laughter to mask their sorrow. When Blanqui crossed a hill, the Tunback had not yet appeared, but through his binoculars, he discovered a passage to China. In this unexpected way, they had completed their mission to find a new route. Blanqui hurriedly marked it on the map. He couldn't help but laugh. Feeling lucky, just as he was about to bring the news back to Captain Crozier, he heard the Tunbacks roar behind him. Blanqui didn't stand a chance. Hodgson, who had just been nibbling on boots, was now eating the finest fresh meat, the most sumptuous meal the crew had eaten in 3 years, but their expressions were filled with guilt because the meat was cut from their recently deceased comrade. Under the double pressure of hunger and Hickey's threats, the crew finally crossed the last moral boundary. At this moment, Hickey had completely turned to the dark side. He basked in the Arctic sunlight, looking like a demon cloaked in human skin. To completely crush Crozier, Hickey placed an undercover scout in Crozier's camp. Golding falsely claimed that he had scouted a new passage through his telescope, one wide enough for their ships to pass through. This way, they could retrieve the ships, and in just a few weeks, they would be able to cross the Arctic. This news excited Crozier, who quickly brought the crew to investigate. When they arrived, they found only ice and land, with no sign of the passage. As Crozier raised his binoculars to check, Golding slipped away from the group. By the time Crozier and his crew reacted, they were surrounded by Hickey's team, and one of the crew members was killed on the spot. To save the remaining crew, Crozier ordered Edward to put down his gun and volunteered to become Hickey's prisoner. Before leaving, Crozier reminded Edward to continue leading the crew south as planned. If he survived, he would come to find them. When Crozier was brought to the camp, he had already been beaten black and blue. Hickey couldn't help but gloat, remarking how he used to be just a low-ranking officer under Crozier, but now he could speak to the great captain as an equal. Crozier sneered at Hickey's twisted thoughts. As Crozier turned, he noticed the boots Hickey was wearing had the name of the late first mate James engraved on them. It was unbelievable that Hickey had dug up James's body just to feed himself. Though seething with anger, Crozier was helpless. While treating Crozier's wounds, Goodsir informed him about the armaments at Hickey's camp. With a clear understanding of the situation, Crozier told Goodsir to prepare himself. Although Crozier had told Edward to continue south, he knew Edward's character well. Edward would likely lead a rescue party of armed crew members before nightfall, but Goodsir didn't plan to leave. He felt his hands were stained with his comrades' blood, though he hadn't eaten any of their flesh. He felt overwhelmingly guilty. At this point, Goodsir's mind was already made up, and he instructed Crozier that if he ever turned into food he could only eat the skin of the soles of his thickest feet. Crozier didn't want Goodsir to be so pessimistic, but he remembered his words. At the same time, Crozier told the few crew members who no longer wished to be under Hickey's threat to be ready to leave when rescue arrived. But, to everyone's surprise, Edward, just as Crozier had expected, planned to pull together a small squad to attack Hickey's camp and launch a rescue mission, but the remaining crew members didn't want to take the risk. They privately voted to continue south in the morning. In the face of life and death, military orders and faith seemed worthless. They left 3 cans of food outside the tent, abandoning the sick crew members. Weakly, Edward could only watch as the crew left and he too became an outcast. In his delirium, he saw a table of delicious food, with Captain Crozier seated before it. He crawled towards Crozier, pleading for help but never got a response. Even in his final moments, this loyal crew member thought of his revered captain. When Crozier woke up in the morning, wondering why Edward hadn't come to rescue him, a crew member brought him out for breakfast. To his horror, the morning's meal was Goodsir. Seeing Goodsir's body, Crozier was filled with rage.
You'd waste this man. Of all men.
The crew explained that Goodsir had committed suicide. Then Crozier realized that Goodsir was saying goodbye to him last night. Hickey invited Crozier to sit and eat, but Crozier resolutely refused to desecrate his friend's body. Hickey, however, had his ways. He said if Crozier didn't eat, he would kill 1 crew member every hour, and he immediately knocked Tozer unconscious with a gun. Crozier couldn't bear to see more crew members die. Trembling, he approached Goodsir's body, cut a piece of flesh from his foot, and put it in his mouth. After the meal, Hickey ordered the crew to drag the supply boat to the hilltop. Apart from a few loyal followers, everyone else was bound by iron chains, turned into slaves. Hickey lied, saying they were there to kill the Tunbak, but once at the top, he revealed his true identity. He was not the real Hickey. The real Hickey was a young man who had received permission to board the ship. Before boarding, this imposter killed him and took his name. An officer had noticed the discrepancy in his appearance from the photo, but Hickey lied, saying he had grown a beard. He had infiltrated the crew as an ordinary sailor. Irving was the first to meet Hickey, instructing him to stow his luggage on the lowest deck, but Hickey didn't know where it was. Hickey's answer Irving could not help but doubt whether he was a crew member or not, and because of this statement Hickey stabbed Irving dozens of times and killed him. The imposter Hickey was originally a heinous criminal, seeking a new life in the New World through this voyage. Instead, he was trapped in the Arctic for 3 years and nearly froze to death. Hearing this, Tozer realized he had been deceived and shouted for Hickey to release him. The crew who had eaten Goodsir's flesh began showing signs of poisoning, vomiting uncontrollably. Hickey started chanting Inuit incantations, intending to form a pact with the Tunbak to survive in the Arctic. But after chanting for a long time, there was no response. Then he stood at the bow of the ship, dancing and flailing as if possessed. Crozier, meanwhile, was thinking of how to escape, signaling to the crew members who planned to flee with him. Before they could act, They heard the Tunbaks roar nearby. Through his binoculars, Hickey saw the massive form of the Tunbak rapidly approaching from a few hundred meters away. The Tunbak first killed a guard upon arrival. In the chaos, Hodgson tried to grab the guard's keys but was just out of reach due to the chains. In an instant, the old sailor was pounced on by the Tunbak. Crozier and the others hid below the boat to avoid the Tunbak's attack. Hodgson got the keys but couldn't unlock the chains in time and was devoured by the Tunbak. A terrified crew member tried to hide under the boat but was dragged out and killed by the Tunbak. Others were trying to escape the Tunbak's pursuit, but Hickey pulled out his tongue, intending to cut it off and make a pact with the Tunbak like Lady Silence.